Love is the most powerful force in the world. It can heal, inspire, and transform. But for some, it's also a mystery, something they never saw coming, something they never thought they'd find. Love is the one thing that people have spent centuries chasing. You hear about it, dream about it, even search for it. But when it hits you, when it finally finds you, it's never how you expected. It's never perfect, and it's never simple. For many of us, love comes when we stop searching so hard, when we stop trying to make it fit into our world and instead allow it to transform us. True love doesn't always come wrapped in a perfect package. Sometimes it comes in the form of a mistake or an accident. But that's what makes it real, raw, messy, and worth every moment. For someone like Lucas Keller, love was something he believed he had long since lost. At 35, he was the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. He had money, fame, power, everything a man could ever want. And yet, inside, he felt like something was missing. The success, the awards, the acclaim, none of it filled the void he carried deep within him. The loneliness, the emptiness, it was always there, even in the moments when he was surrounded by people. But what if Lucas had it all wrong? What if the one thing that could fill that emptiness wasn't in his boardroom, his meetings, or his wealth? What if the answer was somewhere he least expected? One night, a decision was made, a single, impulsive moment of wild abandon. A mistake, perhaps, but a decision that would change Lucas's life forever. He woke up the next morning with no memory of the night before, only to find himself married to a complete stranger, a woman he had never met before, a woman who had just hours ago been a stranger to him, and now she was his wife. How did it happen? Was it a joke, a mistake, a one-night stand gone wrong? Or was it fate? Success is a lonely road. It's a phrase often whispered by those who climb it, hoping to reach the summit, but too afraid to acknowledge the view from the top. Lucas Keller was a man who had reached that summit. He had everything: the mansion in the sky, the luxury cars, the endless wealth, and the endless meetings with billion-dollar clients. He was the CEO of Keller Technologies, a name known across the globe, a name synonymous with success. But despite all of it, despite the applause, the recognition, the admiration of those around him, there was a nagging emptiness that Lucas could never escape. He wasn't alone in the traditional sense. He had employees, colleagues, acquaintances, even a small circle of people who admired him for his genius. But even in the midst of it all, Lucas felt isolated. And it wasn't because he was an introvert. It wasn't because he lacked the ability to connect with people. Number Lucas was skilled in the art of conversation. He could charm anyone with his words, make deals, and forge relationships that others could only dream of. But deep down, when the lights were dimmed, when the crowd had left, and the conference calls had ended, he was alone. Alone in a penthouse that stretched across the skyline of the city, its glass walls offering a spectacular view of the world below. But for all his beauty, for all his wealth, it was empty. The silence in that room at night felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. Lucas had achieved everything the world had told him he needed to be happy. But as he sat in his sleek designer chair, looking out at the city lights that shone below like 1,000 tiny stars, he realized something he hadn't before. All this, it didn't matter. He was empty inside. For Lucas, the hours blurred into one long stream of meetings and decisions. There was always another deal to close, another business to manage, another decision to make. The pressure was constant. It never stopped. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped living for himself. He had built an empire, but there was nothing in that empire that could fill the hole in his chest. No amount of money, no awards, no praise or status could fill it. His success, while undeniable, had come at a cost. And that cost was more than just time. It was his ability to feel anything real, anything authentic. The loneliness didn't come from being physically alone. It came from something deeper. The realization that he had no one who truly knew him. No one who cared about him as Lucas, not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the mogul, just the man beneath it all. And as he sat in his penthouse, scrolling through messages, looking at his watch, each minute ticking by like the last, each second feeling more meaningless than the one before, he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. The emptiness, It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Lucas had been passionate, driven by more than just numbers and profit margins. He used to believe in the idea of making a difference, of changing the world through technology. He believed in the people he worked with, and the purpose of his company. But over time, the hustle had overtaken him. The constant pressure to be the best, the desire to stay ahead of the competition, it all became a game. The same game over and over again. He had won it, and now it didn't feel like a victory at all. What did it matter if he had the world at his feet when he couldn't even feel content for more than a few minutes? He had built walls around himself, deliberately isolating himself from the very thing that could have healed him: human connection, love. But the problem was, the longer he kept himself buried in his work, the deeper that hole inside him became. It was late one evening when Lucas stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. The world was moving, racing below him. He could see it all: businessmen heading home, young couples walking hand in hand through the streets, a life happening without him, a life he wasn't a part of. He had everything, and yet he had nothing. No one to come home to, no one to share his triumphs, no one to share his failures with, no one to listen when he was tired of pretending. As the night deepened, Lucas felt the weight of the emptiness pressing in on him. The life he had built, all the success, what was it worth if it left him feeling like this? This wasn't the man he wanted to be. This wasn't the man he thought he'd become. For the first time, Lucas didn't have an answer, and the uncertainty scared him more than anything else. The man who had conquered the business world, who had everything most people could only dream of, was now standing on the edge of his own loneliness. The very thing he thought would fulfill him, his work, his empire, had left him empty. What did all the success mean if there was no one there to share it with? Lucas had reached the pinnacle of his career, but at what cost? In the silence of his penthouse, looking out at the city below, he realized that no amount of wealth could fill the hole inside him. And for the first time, Lucas Keller began to ask himself a question that had never crossed his mind before. What happens when everything you've worked for leaves you with nothing? In the heart of the city, amidst the hustle and bustle, there was someone who had learned to disappear. Emma Brooks wasn't the kind of person who sought attention. In fact, she did everything in her power to avoid it. She had learned early on that being invisible was the best way to protect herself, to avoid the scrutiny, the questions, the judgment. The world around her seemed to be chasing after the next big thing, the next shiny object, the next big deal. But Emma didn't care about any of that. She wasn't chasing anything. She was just trying to keep her head above water, to survive in a world that had taken everything from her. Emma Brooks was no stranger to hardship. If anything, she had become far too familiar with it. But what set her apart was her quiet strength, her ability to rise above circumstances that had tried to break her. Her life had been shaped by things that most people would never understand, by betrayal, heartbreak, and the quiet determination to rebuild after everything had crumbled. She hadn't asked for the pain that came with those experiences, nor had she asked for the lessons they taught her. But life didn't give her the choice. Raised in a small town, Emma had always been someone who preferred the simple things. She didn't care about wealth or status. Her childhood had been filled with love, with family dinners, with lazy summer days spent in the backyard. Her parents had worked hard to provide for her and her siblings, but they were far from rich. They lived humbly, but there was always warmth, always laughter in their home. Emma had learned early on that happiness wasn't measured in what you had. It was about who you had beside you. But then, life happened. Betrayal came from the least expected places, shattering the foundation of everything she thought she knew. Her father, a man she had looked up to her entire life, had made a choice that altered the course of their future. The betrayal was deep, rooted in lies that Emma couldn't comprehend, but that she would spend years trying to process. The shame and judgment that followed destroyed their family's name, turning friends and acquaintances into strangers. The world she had known was suddenly upside down. What had once been a home filled with security and love was now a place of secrets, isolation, and pain. Emma's father, once the pillar of their family, was no longer the man he used to be. The scandal had left him hollow, broken, and Emma's mother, who had always been strong, was now reduced to a mere shadow of herself. The weight of their struggles, of their losses, pressed down on Emma's shoulders. It was in the aftermath of this devastation that Emma made a decision that would change her life forever. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in a place where the past haunted her at every turn. She packed up what little she had left and moved to the city, hoping that anonymity would provide her with the chance to start over. The city wasn't kind to newcomers, but it was better than staying where she felt trapped by memories. The bustling streets, the noise, the crowds, they all seemed to swallow her up, but it was a relief. In the anonymity of the city, she didn't have to face the eyes of those who remembered her family. She didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to justify the things that were beyond her control. Emma took a job as a waitress in a small diner on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, certainly not glamorous, but it was enough. The hours were long, the work exhausting, but it kept her busy. She kept her head down, focused on the job, and kept her distance from the world. She didn't want to get close to anyone. She didn't trust people anymore. And the last thing she needed was to invite more trouble into her life. The diner was nothing special, a hole-in-the-wall establishment that only the locals frequented. But for Emma, it was perfect. The regulars didn't ask questions. The work was simple, and for the first time in a long while, she could focus on something other than the chaos of her past. The place was quiet, the kind of place where you could sit alone and not be bothered. The patrons came and went, mostly middle-aged men and women who had long ago given up on the idea of chasing anything other than the routine. The most excitement the diner saw was when someone spilled coffee or when the jukebox played a new song. To some, it was a dead-end job. To Emma, it was a sanctuary. She wasn't running from anything in particular. She was just trying to keep her life simple, to keep her world small. The less she interacted with others, the better. She had no desire for more. No desire to get close to anyone who might eventually leave her. Love was something that had hurt her in the past, and she couldn't bear the thought of letting herself feel that again. So, she kept her heart locked up, kept it guarded. She had to. For her own sake. The hours in the diner passed like any other endless refills of coffee, quick exchanges with customers, the same conversations every day. Emma was used to it by now. The noise, the clatter of plates, the soft murmur of voices, it was all part of the routine. She was used to being invisible, used to moving quietly through life without drawing attention to herself. The diner she worked at became a refuge, the one place where she could be something other than the daughter of a man who had betrayed everyone who loved him. The customers came and went, all strangers, and all she needed to do was keep her distance. She kept her head down, her days filled with the mindless tasks of refilling coffee cups, taking orders, and exchanging pleasantries. She didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear about their hopes, their dreams. She had learned long ago that people didn't stay in your life long enough for it to matter. So she focused on work, keeping her interactions brief and her emotions locked away. It was simpler that way. But that night, things were different. The bell above the door jingled as a man stepped into the diner. At first, Emma didn't notice him. Her eyes were focused on the stack of dishes in front of her, but then she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the counter. She glanced up, expecting another regular, another quiet customer, but what she saw made her stop in her tracks. The man was tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit that looked out of place in a small diner like this. He was polished, expensive, and everything about him screamed, "Out of her league." Emma quickly turned away, focusing back on the counter. She wasn't about to get caught up in something she didn't understand. She had no room for distractions. Her life had been about simple routines, not the kind of drama a man like him might bring. Still, her curiosity got the better of her, and she found herself glancing up again. There he was, sitting at the counter, eyes scanning the room. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he looked away, and Emma quickly focused on the mug in her hand. But then, their eyes met. It wasn't an ordinary glance. There was something different about it. Something that made Emma's breath hitch, just for a second. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice steady, but her heart beat faster than she was used to. The man nodded, and there was a slight pause before he spoke again, his voice smooth. "Just coffee, black." Emma felt a strange, unspoken tension fill the air, but she pushed it down. She was just doing her job. She poured the coffee and set the mug down in front of him, careful not to make eye contact again. She had learned that the less she interacted, the better. But as she turned away, she felt his gaze follow her. And for the first time in a long while, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was seen, truly seen in a way she didn't want to be. It was unnerving, yet strangely comforting. Emma had learned to keep her emotions in check, to close her heart off, to not let anyone close enough to hurt her. She wasn't interested in love, especially not after everything she'd been through. She'd seen the damage love could do, and she wasn't willing to risk it again. Her past had taught her that love was messy, unpredictable, and ultimately painful. She had once believed in it, had once given her heart freely. But the betrayal of those she trusted had left her with scars she didn't know how to heal. She had sworn off love completely, convinced herself that it wasn't something she needed. The pain it brought was too much to bear, and she refused to let herself fall victim to it again. But when she placed the coffee down in front of him, their hands brushed for a split second. It was nothing, barely a touch. But for some reason, Emma couldn't shake it. The briefest of moments had left her unsettled in a way she couldn't explain. She quickly turned away, trying to dismiss it. It was just a simple touch, nothing more. And yet, she found herself thinking about it long after he left. The way his eyes had looked at her, the way his presence lingered in the air, even when he was gone. She shook the thought from her mind. She wasn't about to let herself fall for someone who was clearly out of her reach. He was a stranger, someone who lived in a world so far removed from hers that it was pointless to even think about it. But the truth was, Emma had spent so much time building walls around her heart that the idea of letting anyone in, of letting herself care again, felt impossible. The walls she had put up were strong, carefully constructed over years of hurt. But there was something about that brief moment, about the way he looked at her, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, the walls she had built could be torn down. But she wasn't ready for that. Not now, not after everything. As Emma moved through her shift, she could feel his presence lingering in the back of her mind, but she forced herself to focus. She had to. She couldn't afford to get distracted by feelings she had no intention of exploring. She was fine on her own, and that was how she would keep it. She wasn't sure why the encounter with the man at the counter bothered her so much. It wasn't like she hadn't served handsome, successful men before. It wasn't like she hadn't had her share of fleeting glances or casual conversations. But there was something different about him. Something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about love all along. But Emma wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. And so life continued in the small diner, where she kept herself busy and avoided the thoughts that crept in when she was alone. She could always find something to distract herself, whether it was work or simply the noise of the city outside her small apartment window. But deep down, Emma knew that the encounter with the man in the suit hadn't been as simple as it seemed. Something about him, something in the way their hands had brushed, lingered in her thoughts long after he left. Still, she buried it. She had no room for distractions. She couldn't let herself get caught up in the idea of something more. Several weeks later, Emma found herself in a situation she could never have anticipated. It was a high-profile gala, an event in the heart of the city, where the wealthy and influential came together in a grand ballroom to celebrate, network, and show off their success. Emma had agreed to attend at the last minute, only because a friend had asked her to accompany her. It wasn't her scene. She had no interest in the glittering world of wealth and prestige. But a friend had been insistent, and Emma, always the one to avoid confrontation, reluctantly agreed. The gala was everything she had expected and more. The opulence of the place, the sparkling chandeliers overhead, the laughter and clinking of champagne glasses, it all felt like a world she didn't belong in. She could hardly stand the shallow conversations, the people fawning over one another in search of status and connection. The room felt suffocating. The smell of expensive perfume, the polished shoes of businessmen, the laughter that seemed so rehearsed, it all left her wanting to escape. As Emma made her way through the crowd, trying to keep a low profile and avoid the glances of people who didn't recognize her, she found herself at the edge of the room. She stood there, leaning against a column, watching the sea of well-dressed strangers as they mingled. She could already feel the tension creeping into her chest. She wasn't here for business, she wasn't here for networking, she was just trying to survive the night. It was then that her eyes fell on him, Lucas Keller. At first, she didn't recognize him, but then something clicked. It was the man from the diner. The one who had sat at the counter that day, the man whose gaze had lingered on her, making her feel strangely seen. She hadn't expected to encounter him again, certainly not in a setting like this. He looked out of place here. Too stiff, too polished for a casual diner like hers. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by people who clearly recognized him. As Emma stood there, a sense of unease crept up on her. What were the chances? She couldn't escape this man. She could feel the pull of his presence from across the room, as if he was the only one who truly stood out in this sea of suits and dresses. He wasn't just another stranger in the crowd. He was Lucas Keller, the tech mogul, the billionaire CEO, a man who lived in a world she could never be a part of. Her gaze stayed on him for a moment too long. She quickly looked away, feeling a flush of heat on her cheeks. But before she could turn and slip back into the crowd, something happened that she didn't expect. Lucas's eyes met hers. There it was again, the same intensity that had been there the day he walked into her diner. For a brief second, the world around them seemed to quiet, and in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. He was looking at her, and for the first time since she'd seen him, Emma felt a strange pull. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper. She couldn't name it, couldn't explain it. It was like something inside her responded to the way he saw her, not as a waitress, not as a stranger, but as a person. Emma couldn't deny it. The chemistry was there. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what any of this meant, but Lucas didn't let the moment pass unnoticed. He moved through the crowd with surprising ease, cutting through the sea of people until he was standing before her. There was no smile at first, no charming greeting, just a look, an acknowledgement that they both recognized something, though neither knew what. "Hello," he said simply, his voice smooth, calm. Emma blinked, caught off guard by the directness of his approach. "Hi," she replied, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. "You weren't supposed to be here, were you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Seems a bit out of your usual scene." Emma felt a laugh bubbling up in her throat, but she suppressed it. There was something about the way he spoke to her, like he didn't see her as just another attendee of the gala, but as someone different, someone worth noticing. "I could say the same about you," she said, smiling awkwardly, "but I guess we're both out of place." Lucas chuckled, his gaze softening. "Perhaps. But then, I don't mind being out of place sometimes." They stood there, the noise of the gala fading as they talked. Their conversation didn't follow the usual small talk that Emma had grown so used to. No pretenses, no formalities, just a real exchange between two strangers who seemed to understand that there was more to life than the glitter and glamour around them. As the conversation continued, Emma found herself opening up, speaking more freely than she had in years. She spoke about her life, about the simplicity she had come to appreciate, and for once, it felt like someone was listening, not just hearing, but actually listening. Lucas, in turn, spoke of his own struggles, the weight of expectation that came with being a billionaire CEO. It wasn't the typical conversation one would have in this setting. There were no talks of investments or corporate ventures. Instead, it was something more human, something deeper. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she wasn't just a waitress, an invisible face in the crowd. With Lucas, she felt seen, understood in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the night wore on, the two of them became inseparable. They talked, laughed, and drank more than they probably should have. Emma could feel the effect of the champagne coursing through her veins, making her feel lightheaded and carefree. The wall she had built around herself seemed to be crumbling, bit by bit. Lucas, too, seemed to loosen up. His usually composed demeanor softened with each passing minute, and Emma found herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't fully explain. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but it wasn't just physical. It was emotional, raw, and real. As they stood near the balcony overlooking the city, their conversation became more playful. There were no more pretenses, no more barriers. They were two people, caught up in the moment, caught up in each other's presence. "You know, this might be the best mistake I've ever made," Lucas said with a grin, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Emma laughed. "What makes you think this is a mistake?" He took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto hers. "Maybe because I'm about to do something I'll regret." Before she could respond, Lucas leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was spontaneous, unplanned, but not unwelcome. The moment hung between them, charged with electricity. And then, the next thing they both knew, they were standing in front of the altar, eyes wide in disbelief. The night had blurred together, too much champagne, too much emotion, and they had made a decision. A rash, impulsive decision. They were married. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, but in the midst of the whirlwind and the chaos of their shared emotions, it had. The next morning, Lucas woke up with a headache and a strange sense of disbelief. The room was still dim, the sunlight just beginning to break through the curtains. He rubbed his eyes, trying to remember what had happened the night before. His gaze shifted, and then it hit him. The ring on his finger. The ring that confirmed the impossible truth. He was married. And lying beside him was Emma. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the room. Lucas blinked, his head pounding as he tried to make sense of the disorienting fog in his mind. He sat up slowly, the room spinning slightly as he rubbed his forehead. It took a few moments for his surroundings to fully register. The luxurious hotel suite, the expensive decor, the kind of room he was used to waking up in. But something was different today. He glanced down at his left hand, and that's when it hit him again. The heavy weight of the ring on his finger. His heart skipped a beat as he took in the reality of what had happened the night before. He was married to Emma. He turned to look at her, still lying next to him in the bed, her face peaceful in sleep. She looked so different in the quiet of the morning, soft and vulnerable. She wasn't the woman he had met at the gala or the one who had shared wild moments with him. No, now she was just Emma, his wife. The fog in his mind began to clear, and the pieces of the night before started to come back to him in flashes. The drinks, the laughter, the undeniable chemistry, the connection that had built between them. They had been swept up in the moment, two people with pasts that had left them scarred, yet for one brief night, they had found solace in each other's company. But now, with the morning sun pouring in, everything felt more complicated. As Emma began to stir beside him, Lucas could feel the weight of the situation settling in. How had this happened? He didn't remember the details. He remembered the kiss, the impulsiveness, but the steps in between, they were a blur. He had always been in control, always made the right decisions. But last night, none of that mattered. It was as though the walls he'd spent years building around himself had crumbled in an instant. And then Emma opened her eyes. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both processing the same thing at the same time, the surreal reality of their situation. Emma sat up slowly, her eyes looking around the room as if she too was trying to figure out how they had ended up here. The truth slowly began to sink in, and a wave of discomfort washed over her. What happened? Emma asked quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. She rubbed her eyes as if to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Lucas opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. How could he explain this? How could he tell her that, just a few hours ago, he had been caught up in an uncontrollable whirlwind of emotions, letting the night slip through his fingers without fully understanding the consequences? Lucas started but paused, unsure. I think we got married. Emma blinked, processing the words slowly. Married? Her eyes widened, and she looked down at her own hand, noticing the ring. She pulled it off quickly, staring at it like it might burn her. But how? Why? She was in shock, and it was clear to Lucas that she didn't remember the details of the night any better than he did. But the confusion in her voice, the unease that marked her expression, it was undeniable. This wasn't what she had planned, and it certainly wasn't what he had planned. Emma swung her legs off the bed and sat up, putting her hands on her face in disbelief. This is insane, she muttered to herself, her mind racing. How did we even... The sudden rush of emotions hit Emma all at once. The guilt, the fear, the confusion. Everything was happening too fast, too out of her control, and she hated it. She hated the fact that her life was spiraling out of her hands once again. Just when she thought she had finally found some stability, some peace in her life, here she was, waking up, married to a stranger, a man she had met only a few hours ago at a gala. A man who came from an entirely different world than hers. Emma had sworn she would never let herself get caught up in a situation like this. She had worked so hard to build walls around her heart, to protect herself from the pain of love. She had told herself time and time again that she didn't need anyone, that she was fine on her own. She didn't trust easily. She didn't let people close. Not after everything that had happened in her life. And yet, here she was, married, to a man she barely knew. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of it all. The decision to even attend the gala, the conversation with him, the alcohol, everything had been a blur. The connection between them had felt so natural, so easy. But now, with the clarity of morning, Emma realized that it wasn't just the alcohol clouding her judgment. It was the deep, unspoken desire to be seen, to be understood, to not be alone. But that was dangerous. She knew it was. Letting someone in had always been a risk, and it had never ended well. She had been burned too many times before. She had learned the hard way that love was not something you could count on. It could come, but it could also disappear in an instant, leaving you with nothing but the wreckage it left behind. Emma stood up, pacing the room, her hands running through her hair as she tried to steady her breathing. The panic was building inside her, a knot forming in her stomach. She felt trapped, caught between the whirlwind of emotions that had led to this moment and the reality that she was now married to a man who was a stranger to her in so many ways. How did this happen? She had spent so long building walls around her heart, keeping people at arm's length so they couldn't hurt her. She had sworn she would never let herself fall in love again. But now, she was married to a man she barely knew, and the fear of letting herself trust again, of opening up to someone else, was overwhelming. She had spent years guarding her heart, convincing herself that love wasn't worth it. She had closed herself off from the possibility of being hurt again. And now, just like that, everything she had worked so hard to protect felt like it was slipping away. Her heart, which she had kept hidden and safe, was beginning to crack, and she hated it. She hated that she had let this happen. Emma didn't know if she could handle the kind of vulnerability that marriage demanded. It wasn't just the commitment, it was the idea of giving someone else the power to break her, to shatter the walls she had spent so long building. And yet, there she was, looking at Lucas, this man who had somehow made his way into her life, making her question everything she had known to be true about love. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, watching Emma pace back and forth. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the uncertainty, the confusion, and it mirrored his own feelings. He didn't know what had happened last night. All he knew was that he had made a decision, one that seemed to have altered the course of his life in a way he didn't fully understand. He could tell she was struggling. He could see it in the way she was moving, the way she couldn't quite meet his gaze. He had always been a man in control, but right now, he felt like he was grasping at straws, unsure of what to do or how to fix what had been broken in a single night. "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with an unexpected tenderness. "I don't know what happened last night, but I don't regret it." Her head snapped toward him at the sound of his voice, her eyes wide with disbelief. You don't regret it?" she repeated, her voice shaky. Lucas stood up, walking toward her slowly, his gaze steady. I'm not sure what this means, but I don't regret it. I can't explain it, but there's something about you, about us, that feels different, and I don't want to let it go." Emma shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't real. This wasn't what she had planned. She couldn't let herself get caught up in something that felt too good to be true. "I can't do this," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't let myself fall for someone again." He had made a decision in the heat of the moment, without thinking about the consequences. There was no denying that. The alcohol had blurred his judgment, and the emotions had carried him to a place where his logical mind had taken a back seat. But waking up to the reality of what had happened made him feel like he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Lucas Keller was a man who prided himself on control. He controlled his company, his future, even his own emotions. But now, with the ring on his finger and Emma lying next to him, he realized how out of control he felt, and it terrified him. He could have easily walked away. He could have brushed it off as a mistake, as a crazy night that wouldn't mean anything in the long run. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to do it. For the first time, he didn't want to run from something. He wanted to face it. "I can't let her go," he thought to himself. It wasn't just about the marriage. It wasn't about some impulsive decision they had made after too many drinks. It was about something deeper. It was about the feeling he had when he was with Emma. The way she made him feel like he was more than just the man behind Keller Technologies. She made him feel like him. And for Lucas, that was something he had never been able to experience before. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to make it right. And for the first time, he didn't care how messy it would be. He didn't care about the logistics, about the damage it might cause to his image, about the complications it might bring. What mattered now was Emma. Lucas turned back to face Emma, who was now sitting on the edge of the bed, staring down at her hands. She was lost in thought, her expression distant, as though she were still processing everything that had happened. He took a deep breath and walked toward her, his movements steady but unsure. This was the moment where he had to decide. Was he going to continue with the same old pattern of detachment, of letting his actions and decisions be controlled by his career and the expectations of others? Or was he going to do something different? Was he going to take responsibility for what he had done, even if it was messy, even if it was uncomfortable? Emma, Lucas began, his voice softer than usual. She didn't look up at him at first. But then, slowly, she met his gaze. Her eyes were filled with confusion, hurt, and something else. Something Lucas couldn't place but knew was important. I don't know what happened last night, he said, sitting beside her. But I want to make it right. I don't want to run from this. Emma shook her head, as if she couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Make it right? How can you possibly make this right? We're strangers. We're married, and we don't even remember how it happened. Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder gently. I know, but I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen. I want to try. I'm not going to walk away from this. Her eyes filled with uncertainty, and Lucas felt the sting of her doubt. But he wasn't going to back down. He had spent so long running from things that were real, from things that mattered, but not anymore. Not this time. I don't know what this is or how we got here, he continued, but I want to find out, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, to make it right. I'm not going anywhere. Lucas sat there in silence, his hand still on her shoulder, waiting for her response. His heart pounded in his chest, the uncertainty of it all making him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. But he was willing to face it. He had to. The journey ahead was unknown. The path was messy, and it would be anything but easy. But for the first time, Lucas felt like he wanted something real, something beyond the confines of his empire. And maybe, just maybe, he could start building it with Emma. I can't let myself fall for someone again. Emma's words echoed in Lucas's mind as he sat on the edge of the bed, watching her walk away from him. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the feeling behind them that lingered. The fear, the reluctance, the shield she had built around her heart. For a moment, he considered stepping away, letting her be. After all, what was he really offering her? A life of uncertainty, a rash decision made in the heat of the moment. There was no way of knowing what this would all lead to, and it would be easy for him to just walk away and pretend it never happened. After all, that's what he had done so many times in the past. Escape when things got too messy, too complicated. But something inside him refused to do that this time. This was different. Lucas wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it was the way Emma looked at him with a mixture of confusion and longing, or the quiet way she had shared her past with him. But there was something about her that drew him in, something that made him want to understand her, to be there for her. Not just as a stranger, not just as her husband for the night, but as someone who could share in the brokenness of the world, and maybe, just maybe, help heal it. The days that followed were filled with awkward silences and tentative conversations. Every morning, Lucas would wake up and wonder what he could say to Emma, what he could do to bridge the gap between them. But every time he tried to start a conversation, she would retreat, pulling back into herself as if afraid to let him in. Emma was distant, her eyes always clouded with something he couldn't quite reach, and yet Lucas was patient. He understood the wall she had built, the scars she carried with her. He had his own walls, his own reasons for keeping people at arm's length. He knew what it felt like to be afraid of vulnerability, to be terrified of letting someone close only to have them hurt you. But that didn't stop him from trying. It wasn't easy. There were times when Lucas thought she would never open up, never let go of her fears. But slowly, over the days that turned into weeks, something began to change. They began to talk, really talk. Not just about what had happened the night they got married, but about their lives, their dreams, their struggles. They spoke about their past, the pain they had both endured, the mistakes they had made. Emma talked about her family, about how everything had fallen apart, and how the weight of betrayal had shaped her into the person she was now. She spoke of her childhood, of the love she had once felt, and the deep scars that still lingered in her heart. It was painful to hear, but it was the first time she had ever allowed herself to be so honest with anyone. And for Lucas, it was a revelation. For the first time, he understood her, not just as a woman, not just as a stranger he had married on impulse, but as a person who had lived through something real. And it made him want to protect her, to be the person who could show her that not all love was pain, that not all relationships ended in betrayal. And as Emma opened up, so did Lucas. He talked about the pressure of his career, the weight of the empire he had built, and the loneliness that came with it. He spoke about his fears of failure, fears of being vulnerable, of letting someone in. He told her about his childhood, about how his parents had never been able to offer him the kind of love and support he craved, and how he had spent his life trying to fill that void with success, power, and control. But none of it had worked. None of it had made him feel whole. He had always been so focused on what he could achieve, what he could build, but standing there, talking to Emma, he realized that none of it had ever mattered. What had always mattered was human connection. It was trust. It was vulnerability. And, in a way, he had been just as closed off as she had been, afraid to let anyone see the real him, afraid to admit that he didn't have all the answers, that he wasn't invincible. As they shared their truths, as they let down their guards, they began to understand each other in a way neither of them had expected. It wasn't about perfection or control. It wasn't about the flashy success that Lucas had worked so hard for, or the past that Emma couldn't escape. It was about accepting each other, flaws and all. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Lucas couldn't help but notice how much closer they had become. The distance between them had shrunk, and Emma's presence no longer felt like a wall he had to break through. She was no longer a stranger. She was becoming a part of his life in a way that felt more real than anything he had experienced in a long time. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked softly, his gaze fixed on her. Emma paused, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the coffee cup in her hands. She looked up at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Regret what?" she replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. "Getting married," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the moment, it felt impulsive. I didn't think about what it would mean, but now that we're here, with everything so complicated, I wonder if you regret it." For a moment, Emma didn't speak. Her gaze dropped to the cup in her hands again, her brow furrowing slightly. "Maybe," she said slowly, "but maybe I don't. Not as much as I thought I would." Lucas watched her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You know, I don't regret it either." Emma looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly in disbelief. "You don't?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "I think this whole thing, as messy as it is the most honest thing I've done in a long time." She frowned, unsure of what to make of his words. "But we're still strangers. We barely know each other." "I know," Lucas replied, his voice soft and sincere. "But isn't that the point? We've both been carrying our pasts, our fears, and our baggage. And we've both been trying to protect ourselves from getting hurt. But maybe love isn't about getting everything right. Maybe it's about being willing to take the chance, even when it's scary." Emma was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on him, as though she were searching for something in his eyes. She had never heard anyone speak about love that way, so openly, so vulnerably. "Do you think love is something we can choose?" she asked quietly. Lucas leaned back in his seat, his eyes thoughtful. "I think love is something that finds you when you're ready for it. And it's messy, and it doesn't always make sense. But it's real, and it's the only thing that can make everything else feel worthwhile." Over the next few weeks, Emma and Lucas spent more time together. Their conversations became longer, more meaningful. They began to find joy in the simplest moments, cooking dinner together, talking about their favorite books, and sharing the things that made them laugh. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations of love. It was about building something together day by day in small, quiet ways. Their connection deepened, not just because they were married, but because they had opened their hearts to one another. They had both been broken in their own ways, but they had also learned how to let the cracks show. In doing so, they had found something neither of them had expected: peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was enough. As their bond grew stronger, Emma and Lucas began to realize something important. Love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having all the answers or living up to some ideal. It was about being vulnerable, about trusting someone enough to let them in, even when it was scary. They had both been afraid of love, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what it might cost. But they had learned, through each conversation, through each moment of honesty, that love was not something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. As the days went by, Lucas and Emma began to settle into the unexpected reality of their marriage. What had begun as a wild, impulsive decision made in the haze of emotions and a little too much champagne had slowly turned into something more. Not perfect, not flawless, but real. It wasn't easy. In fact, there were days when they both questioned the sanity of it all. The weight of the decision they had made loomed over them like a shadow. They had barely known each other. They had entered this union on a whim, on the kind of impulse that could easily be seen as a mistake. But there was something different about the way they navigated through it. They made it work. They chose each other not because it was easy, but because they wanted to. And that choice, that willingness to open their hearts to something unexpected, was what began to change everything. In the beginning, their conversations were stilted, full of awkward pauses, as both Lucas and Emma tried to find their footing in this strange new reality. They came from two different worlds. Lucas, the powerful CEO, surrounded by wealth and privilege, had lived his life making deals and decisions that impacted millions. Emma, on the other hand, was a woman who had learned the hard way that trust could be broken in an instant and that the promise of love was often just an illusion. Yet, despite their differences, something had begun to shift between them. They started spending more time together, not as strangers forced into an awkward situation, but as two people genuinely trying to understand each other. They spent evenings talking, walking through the city, exploring their likes and dislikes, finding common ground. They talked about their past, the scars they had both carried for years. Lucas opened up about the loneliness he had felt despite his success, the weight of expectations that came with being a billionaire. He spoke about his upbringing, how he had always been told that success was the key to happiness, but how it never filled the emptiness inside him. Emma too opened up. She told him about the betrayal that had shattered her family, how her father's mistakes had left her with nothing but broken promises. She spoke of the pain of losing trust in those she had loved, how it had taken years for her to rebuild any semblance of peace. But what had always remained in her heart, despite all the heartbreak, was the hope that someday she could find a connection, someone who would understand her, accept her flaws, and make her feel whole again. In these quiet, vulnerable moments, Lucas and Emma began to see each other for who they truly were, not as a billionaire and a waitress, not as two people forced into a marriage, but as individuals who had been hurt, who had been broken, and who now, in this strange twist of fate, had found something they both desperately needed: the possibility of healing. It wasn't without its challenges. There were days when they both felt the weight of their situation pressing down on them. There were awkward moments when they both realized how little they truly knew about each other. But despite it all, they kept choosing to show up, to try. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the grand love story either of them had imagined, but there was a beauty in it. Emma had once believed that love had to be perfect, that it had to be the stuff of fairy tales. She had once dreamed of the grand gestures, the idealized romantic moments that were supposed to fill your heart with joy. But what she learned, through every conversation with Lucas, through every small moment they shared, was that love wasn't perfect. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up for each other, even when things were messy, even when the world didn't make sense. Love was imperfect. It was raw. And that was what made it real. For Lucas, the idea of love had always been something to control, something to fix with power and influence. But in his growing connection with Emma, he realized that love wasn't something to control. It was something to experience. It was something to embrace, even in its messiness, even in its imperfection. He had spent his life chasing after success, thinking it would fill the void in his heart, But what he hadn't realized was that success alone couldn't give him what he truly needed. What he needed was someone to share his life with, someone who could see him for who he truly was, not the CEO, not the billionaire, but just Lucas. And with Emma, he finally understood what that meant. Each day, their relationship grew stronger, not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to accept each other as they were, flaws, mistakes, and all. They weren't in a rush. They weren't pretending to have it all figured out. They were just learning to trust each other, to lean on each other, and to be there for each other. And with that trust came a deeper understanding of themselves. Emma realized that she didn't need to be afraid of love anymore. She didn't have to keep her heart locked away. She didn't have to protect herself from the possibility of being hurt again. Because sometimes love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. Lucas, too, realized that he didn't have to control everything. He didn't have to fix every problem with power or status. He had spent so much of his life trying to make everything work, trying to control every situation, but with Emma, he learned that love was about vulnerability. It was about accepting that you couldn't always fix things, but you could always show up for the people who mattered. In the end, Emma and Lucas realized something important. Love wasn't always the grand, perfect gesture they had once imagined. Sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it was filled with mistakes and missteps. But that was where the beauty lay, in the mess, in the unexpected. Their journey hadn't been what they expected. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. They had started with a mistake, a decision made on impulse, but they had chosen to make it work. They had chosen to embrace the uncertainty, to accept the vulnerability, and to face the future together. And that choice, that decision to embrace love, even when it was messy, was what had brought them to this moment. Love isn't always the grand, perfect gesture we expect. It's not about finding someone who fits into a preconceived idea of what love should look like. It's about finding someone who sees you for who you really are, flaws, fears, and all, and choosing to be there for each other, even when it's messy, even when it's hard. Lucas and Emma didn't know where their journey would take them. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing. They had chosen each other. They had chosen to make their imperfect love something real. And in a world that often feels out of control, sometimes that's all you need. What an emotional ride it's been, hasn't it? From the impulsive decision that changed everything, to the quiet moments of growth and vulnerability between Lucas and Emma, their story is one of unexpected twists, raw emotions, and the power of choosing love. Love, as they learned, isn't about perfection. It's about accepting each other, flaws and all, and daring to open your heart, even when it feels safer to keep it locked away. Lucas and Emma may have started with a hasty decision, but they chose to make it work. And that's what really matters. Making the choice to grow, to trust, and to love, even when life throws the unexpected your way. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life inspired stories of transformation. These stories aren't just about love, they're about growth, healing, and finding the courage to embrace life's messiness. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Lucas and Emma's journey. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter that changed your life? Maybe a moment when everything seemed to fall into place? Or a chance meeting that led to something bigger than you could have imagined? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, love isn't always perfect, but it's always worth fighting for. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.